Hi everyone, and welcome to yet another MOBYCON webinar. Tonight's session will be focused on the protected intersection webinar we did back in April, but we're doing questions sent to us by the audience. I'm Melissa Bruntlett. I'm the International Communications Specialist here at MOBYCON, and today I'm joined by Leonard Naut, who is one of our mobility advisors here, who is going to address your questions and hopefully give you a little more insight. A little bit of housekeeping. If you have questions during the webinar, we don't have time, unfortunately. We had so many submitted. But if you want them answered later, feel free to reach out on social media or send us an email with the email address in the event link. And other than that, I think we can get started.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Melissa. Just for everybody, for an introduction, I hope you all watched the first webinar. If you didn't, we're not going to go into every single detail of the protected intersection, but I do want to give you a slight glimpse of what we're talking about. And that is a protected intersection that we can see on the screen now. So it's an intersection that has the protective islands on the corners, that has the median separating the two ways of traffic where pedestrians can cross, and of course the separated bikeways going across. So just to refresh your brain on what we were talking about in this session, we got a lot of questions. We're going to try and answer them all that we have in this session, and we can start with the first question.
All right, so the first one we have is there some kind of master plan or zoning that designates the road types, and how does the land use regulation work with transportation planning?
It's a good question. Of course, we are a very regulated country, the Netherlands. So we have a very regulated system of transportation and land use planning, but it all comes back down to the sustainable safety system. Within sustainable safety, there's only a few types of road typologies that we use with an accompanying speed limit that is appropriate for that context. So you have your neighborhood streets with a 30 km/h speed limit, you have your arterial streets with a 50 km/h speed limit, and then faster and faster outside the urban area as well. Every city actually has a designated plan for these, for all of their roads. So they designate what type of street that is. And that also reflects on what type of intersection treatment you get. So for example, if you have an intersection of two neighborhood streets, 30 km/h, you don't need much in terms of signage or no traffic lights, obviously. Low traffic volume, low speed, so very low risk. If you get a slightly busier intersection of a distributor or an arterial street that meets a neighborhood street, as you can see in this image, the neighborhood street approaching from the right, you have a different treatment, but still no traffic lights and definitely usually not a protected intersection. Unless in some specific cases, obviously. It's never black and white. And only if there's two arterial streets that meet, then we see preferably a roundabout on the left, but in case there's too much traffic flow and want to accommodate that, then we do a protected signalized intersection, as you can see on the right. And that's all mandated by the transportation plan that every city makes and updates every 10 years usually. So that's a plan that kind of looks like this. In this plan from Gouda, the city of Gouda where the cheese is from, well, used to be from, this city has designated all of these green roads within the urban area as arterial streets, but all of the little gray roads that you can't really see on this map, but everything else basically is a neighborhood street. So you would only find a protected intersection on the intersection of those bigger green and blue lines on the map. Good question.
Good explanation.
Thank you.
All right, our next question is, at protected intersections, is it more common to use zebra or give-way pedestrian crossings?
That's a complicated issue. There's actually a few different views on what you should do at a zebra crossing where the conflict is between pedestrians and cyclists. Some cities say, no, we really want to prioritize the pedestrian and we want to give that zebra crossing full priority over the cycleway. Some cities say, no, it's actually safer to not have a zebra crossing, so no outright pedestrian priority, and let people figure it out for themselves. So there's two photos on the screen now from two different cities. One is from Amsterdam on the left and Utrecht on the right. And on the left you can see that Amsterdam chose to prioritize the pedestrian over the cycleway. That's not consistent anymore. At some intersections you see that they have started to remove the zebra crossing or not put it back in after resurfacing. And on the right, you see Utrecht, which chose to prioritize the cyclist flow. and let them go through. Now, it's not clear-cut which one is safer. Some say a cyclist will disobey the zebra crossing because they're trying to maintain momentum. And actually, for a pedestrian, it is very easy to stop and go. So it's quite easy to yield as a pedestrian for a cyclist. And other people say, no, you have to signal full priority for the pedestrian, even though it might not always be adhered to. So the compliance is a little bit tricky, and especially with the busier cycleways, if there's 100 or 200 cyclists coming through, it is really hard to make them all stop for a pedestrian crossing. So then you might be better off allowing the cyclists to go through first and then the pedestrians to follow after, even though that's not generally in the right order of modes, where we want to prioritize pedestrians over everybody else.
And I guess in some cases when you have that intense flow, like, you know, in bigger cities like Rotterdam or Amsterdam, it's easier to let the bikes flow through, because if they're all stopped, they're waiting for a traffic light. It blocks everything. Yeah.
A pedestrian or a cycle jam is a real thing.
Yeah.
There's a few famous cycleways where it's so busy in rush hour that it would really be chaos if you were trying to stop them all for 1 or 2 pedestrians coming through. Overseas, I would always recommend to put the zebra crossing in, because the flows will be lower and it is more clear about who has right of way, and you really prioritize pedestrians, and they're usually also in the majority anyway. So that would be my recommendation.
Excellent. All right. So our next question, is there a minimum storage length for the location where one vehicle waits after turning right, but not before crossing the bike crossing?
Yep. Short answer is yes. Now you might want to know what it is. So here's an image that displays what we're talking about. This is, you see the little car. Imagine that just turned right. And we always recommend to have a specific amount of meters as storage, so they can stop if necessary. That is not even a minimum, that's just a recommendation to have 5 meters, no more, no less. If you make it or you make it less than 5 meters, it becomes a little bit ambiguous, and people can't make a turn that's good enough to be able to make easy eye contact and see if there's a cyclist coming, for example. So if you don't have the space, the recommendation is actually to put the bikeway right up close to the cars, and pave it in a different color, so it's very obvious for a car that they're turning into it. Now, one misconception is that a car generally doesn't have to stop here. This added 5 meters is basically redundancy, to give people a chance to stop if a cyclist runs a red light, or if the car is too slow turning, or if the bike is too slow, for example, and they drop their keys, whatever. So this is just a redundancy as an extra safety precaution to give a car the opportunity to come to a stop and look before they cross the bikeway. The light phasing will be usually good enough that they avoid having this type of conflict, and a general rule.
Okay.
Oh, there's an image. A nice photo of that shows how this works in practice. So this will be a 5-meter setback basically for the car, and you can see that the car has turned enough to be able to make an easier eye contact with the cyclist. You can see that the cyclist has an orange light, so they're probably trying to catch up, which means that the car might have been, well, if the cyclist would have been a little bit slower, the bike would have to stop, but there's enough space to stop and to see each other. There's enough time built into the design of the intersection.
Excellent. So our next question is also, are there any standards or guidance used for corner radii when we're speaking about these kinds of designs?
Yeah, nice and technical question. So a corner radius, for those, maybe most people know, but maybe some people don't, it's how big is the curve in the curb that you use for bikes turning right and left. And of course there are standards. The Dutch are very rigorous about their standards, although most of our standards are actually guidelines. They're not mandatory, so you don't have to follow them. A lot of cities say they use them in their designs, but you're welcome to diverge from the standards if you feel that's necessary. And that's used to make sure that engineers still use their imagination and their creative thinking to solve problems. And if there's a design or a specific circumstance that doesn't fit the standard, you're not immediately in trouble, because it's not a standard, it's a guideline. But the guidelines say for a bikeway you should always have a turning radius of about 5 meters minimum. Now there's a trade-off. If you make the turning radius bigger, so a more easy curve, a bike can go faster. For example, in our bicycle highways, we tend to use larger curb radius, radii, to allow bikes to go at 30, 35, 45 kilometers an hour, maybe even. Same with highway engineering. You want to be able to let the bikes flow through, but in an urban setting at the intersection, you might intentionally want to slow down the cyclists a little bit, make them change course, which makes them slow down, in which case a 5 meter curb radius can be it's pretty tight, so it can be an effective tool to slow cyclists as they approach the intersection. The downside of that is, there's always a downside, if you do want to slow down a bike, that also can generate more single-sided crashes where a person on a bike just falls off because they tend to hit the curb if the turning is a bit too wiggly.
Right.
And that's a big problem in the Netherlands at the moment, especially with older people on bikes that go, maybe not so experienced on their e-bike. They tend to hit a curb a bit easier. That
makes sense. The next question is, can you speak to drainage? Basically, where does the water flow to in a cycleway and the islands?
Yes. Not an easy answer because drainage is very site-specific. The Netherlands is, for a large part, below sea level, so drainage is extremely important. We also get a reasonable amount of rain, maybe not tropical downpours as in some other parts of the world, but we do get a reasonable amount of rain, so we do spend a lot of time and money making sure that the drainage is right. Now, it's hard to answer this question this easily, but in general, I have a little photo to illustrate what the drainage looks like in a protected intersection in the Netherlands. But obviously that depends on the specific design, how the gradients are, which way the road is draining itself. It's not rocket science, it's not that different from a normal street design, but I think one quite nice detail that is often missed in designs that I see from other countries is that the actual drainage pit is not in the road, but it's in the curb. And that we can do that because it's a very flat country, so it's easy to manipulate the drainage the way you want it to flow. But this does solve a lot of the problems that cyclists with narrow, skinny tires have getting stuck in the drain. If there is a drain in the road and I ride there, I always try and avoid it. So if your bikeway is not that wide, then you might want to swerve, which has potential issues, safety issues, but also just discomfort. And I think this type of design where you just put the drainage in the curb is a really nice attention to detail touch that is often missed in overseas design, and I really hope we can export, it sounds very nerdy, but export these drainage pits to other countries in the world.
That makes sense. And so in this example that you've shown, the engineers have put in tiles, so obviously they're very permeable to water. Would you possibly recommend plants in some locations or greenery? Yeah,
of course. Yeah, any permeable surface, the more permeable, the better. This is still a heat island, quite literally. It's a little bit better than asphalt because it does let some water drip through, like you said. But yeah, you can totally make this a more green space, make it pretty. Obviously, you don't want it too high, so you still want to be able to see a cyclist sitting there. But it's important to make sure that you can make use of those opportunities for infiltration wherever you can.
Cool. The next question is, do cyclists always automatically and legally have priority over motor traffic and whatever the layout, et cetera, with or without lights? How does that work?
Yeah, short answer, no, definitely not. We still have a lot of cars in the Netherlands and a lot of motor traffic, and we are very good at optimizing our streets for cars as well. So no, there's definitely no way that cyclists always have priority over car traffic. But that still comes down to the redundancy in the design. That's why it may look like cyclists have priority over the cars, but that's because there's basically 3 layers of priority in the Dutch protected intersection. There's first, as a motorist, you're taught in driving school the highest authority on who has right of way is the police. So if there's a police officer standing in the road, they tell you what to do and you disregard anything else because they're the full authority on who has right of way and who gets to go in general. If there's no police officer, which is usually a good sign, and there's traffic lights, then obviously the traffic light is next. So the traffic light has, the traffic light overrides whatever markings are on the ground or whatever signs are put in. So while the markings may suggest that this is an intersection where pedestrians have full priority and can just walk across whenever they want, in reality, they still have to adhere to the traffic lights, because if traffic lights are present, they override the markings. But because the design of a protected intersection has that redundancy, this design also works when traffic lights are failing or when the traffic lights are turned off, which some cities do at night to save power or make it safer. It actually can help. A regulated intersection that doesn't rely on traffic lights but on markings is generally safer, depending on the traffic flows. A complicated story that you might want to rewatch the previous webinar if you want a little bit more detail on that. But every protected intersection is designed in a way that it works with the traffic lights but also works without the traffic lights. It just means you look at something as a different type of feature of the intersection design. So if you can go back to the photo with the design, this is, well, you might have heard about this. This is Alexanderplein in Amsterdam, where they studied this intersection and interviewed users, or people on bikes, pedestrians. There's a tram going through. And everybody hated this intersection because the waiting time was too long, and there was not a nice continuous flow. It didn't feel very safe. They studied it to pieces with camera observations, surveys, everything. And then they decided to run a trial and turn the traffic lights off for a few months. They decided that that actually worked better. So the next step, well, the next logical step was for the city to just remove the traffic lights altogether. But as you can see, they didn't alter the configuration of the intersection at all. The markings are the same. It's exactly the same intersection, except the traffic lights are gone. And it operates better. People like it more. The number of crashes has been reduced. And everybody appreciates the intersection a little bit better because bikes can maintain their momentum if it's quiet. Trams still go full priority through the middle, and everybody just looks at each other and has some human negotiation with in the blink of an eye to make sure they get across safely. So yeah, that's a nice feature of a well-designed protected intersection. Works with and without traffic lights, but it doesn't mean bikes or pedestrians have full priority at all times. They only have that when the lights are gone or off.
Or off, yeah. Okay. Our next question is, on a 7-meter wide road with an intersection of streets with two-way car traffic on both, would the first thing to do be to implement a one-way only street to gain space?
That's a very difficult question.
It's a little difficult to read.
It was very fast. So basically, if you have 7 meters and you have two-way car traffic, how do you make space? Well, that's obviously a difficult question, especially without a little bit of context. What I can say is that one-waying a street can be very efficient because you do gain about 3.5 meters of space in this case, which means 2 nice bikeways. But you should always question, do I need a bikeway? Or a separated bikeway. Why do I need that separated bikeway? Because then that generally means there's a lot of cars. If you do have a lot of cars, is a lot of cars a suitable, or what's the suitable amount of cars for a 7-meter wide street? Because it seems to be quite narrow. So maybe you should try and reduce the car volume / car speed first, and then see if you still need a separated bikeway. Because as we saw in the plan of Gouda, about 80% of the streets in the Netherlands actually doesn't feature any bicycle infrastructure because they're under a certain threshold for car traffic, and the car speed is very low because they did watch the traffic calming webinar and they executed it all, or the other way around. And there is an example of what it could look like if you do have a narrow street, but you still want to bring it back to the protected intersection. If you still want a protected intersection, you can absolutely have that without having separated bikeways on all of the legs. That's not necessary. I would actually recommend putting in the protected intersection first if you can't do it all in one go, because that's just where the most number of injuries and fatalities happen. So it is important to tackle the intersections properly. And this is an example from, well, the right one is, I think, from Amsterdam, the left one is from Delft, where you can see that even minor streets that approach a protected intersection, at the intersection, you usually have a little bit more space, so you can splay out those bike lanes and actually bend them out towards the intersection without losing any of the functionality of a protected intersection. That's a lot of protected intersections in a row. But yeah, in short, first always question, do I need bike lanes? Why do I need bike lanes? And can I treat any of those reasons, like speed, volume, can I do something there? And then if you still need them, maybe one-waying is a solution. But the most important thing is don't think you can't do a protected intersection because you don't have space on the approaching street, because that's not necessarily relevant. You can still make it a lot better for people on bikes and pedestrians if you don't have space on the road.
Okay, our next question. When going straight through an intersection, why in protected intersections is the bike path made at a slight S-turn and not the motorized vehicles?
It's a good question. I really like this question, because I did have to think about that for a little bit. I was thinking, yeah, if we make cyclists bend out to create space, why don't we do the same for cars? Why wouldn't you make them bend out or bend in, slow them down, and make sure they go slow? But then I went back to, why do we bend out cyclists in the first place? Because that's actually not entirely necessary. A lot of the designs that we see on Google Maps or on the image on the left, they do feature that bend out, but that's only because the approaching street is not wide enough to have the bikeway 5 meters setback from the car lane. So the one on the right is a very wide street in Amsterdam, where they already have that 5 meter setback, because the street is just a big avenue with trees in the middle. And they don't need to bend out the cyclist. So the bend out itself is not an inherent feature of the protected intersection, but that 5 meter distance from the roadway, that's a very important feature. And if you already have that, don't worry, you don't need to bend out more. Actually makes for a nice and smooth operation for the cyclist. The only thing you want to make sure that is even a fast cyclist can get through safely. So you probably want to separate them in the light phasing, so you never have conflicts. But then I was thinking, wait a minute, I think we actually do bend out cars with a funny S to slow them down. If you watched the previous webinar, you probably remember this image, because this is an intersection in Ridderkerk, close to Rotterdam. You can see there's a little bit of a bend for the bikeway, but they decided that this design was not good enough, and they did need to slow down the cars a little bit. So they did put in a big S-bend, but then we call it a roundabout. And it's actually a lot safer than a signalized intersection. So the safety record of this is fantastic. So yes, we should bend out as an S, the cars, as well as the bikes. But then you also want to take out the lights.
Right.
So it was a great question. First I was very confused about the question, and then I was like, no, actually we should do this. We just call it a roundabout.
Just make the case for more roundabouts.
Maybe we should do a webinar on roundabouts next.
Oh, good idea.
Yes.
All right, moving on. Our next question is, which is best, putting the pedestrian crossing on the inside or outside of the intersection?
Okay, here we go.
We had a good debate about this before we started.
Yes. So this is a question that comes up a lot in the United Kingdom, now also in Canada, where there's a new design. They call it, in the UK it's called the Cyclops. Maybe in Canada they're calling it the inverse protected intersection. It doesn't really matter how you call it. But it is an innovative design in intersection design, or an innovative solution for intersection design, which I applaud. It's great to have people think about it and come up with a new solution. But we get a lot of questions about this. And our first initial response, we saw a render come out of Manchester, and we were like, wow, that looks chaotic. Why did they flip it? So we really investigated this. We actually spoke with the guy who invented the Cyclops. I hope he's watching. Dave, if you're watching. And I still don't like parts of it, but I appreciate it as a solution for a very specific context. And I have a few slides to explain. So first a few reasons why I do not like it. The first is the lack of predictability. One of the important features of a sustainable safety design or a system is that your roadway and your street environment is predictable. So as a driver, I should always know where am I supposed to be, where can I expect people on bikes, and where can I expect people with prams or on foot, where are they going to be. So I can anticipate my speed, my movements, where do I look, which hazard can I identify, or for whom am I going to be a hazard, and when and where, and I can adjust my behavior accordingly. And in this slide you can see this is one of the cyclopses that actually opened, I think last month or 2 months ago in Manchester, where they flipped the bike and the pedestrian crossing. So with a traditional Dutch intersection where there is red, we would say that's a bike crossing, and what currently is green would for us in the Netherlands be the pedestrian crossing, so the pedestrians on the outside. And that aligns really nicely with the street design that approaches this intersection, where you have the footpaths on the outside, then the bike lanes, and then the car lanes in the middle, so designed from the outside in, which is predictable if you have the same order of things go through the intersection. But as you approach the cyclops, at one point this switches, and suddenly you have the bike lane on the outside, then the footpath, and then the car lane in the middle. And as a car driver, that would be confusing and requires some education and probably a long time to get used to. Now, this wouldn't be as big of a hazard if it is not as big a hazard, I have to say, because they do separate the light phases. So you would never have a car turn right across a pedestrian that also has green, which helps, but that assumes that 100% of drivers adhere to traffic lights, and that's just not the case. So there is 1% of drivers who disobey a red light, and that can cause a problem because the first thing they're going to run into is a pedestrian who have a longer exposure time to traffic and can cause a bit of a slightly higher risk. Now, this design is not going to kill anyone. I really don't think this is a huge problem, or it's not a bad design. It's definitely still better than what was there. But I don't think the reason to do it warrants this treatment as opposed to a Dutch-style treatment. But there's more. The second reason why I don't like it, we're not done yet. The second reason why I don't like it is because of bicycle-pedestrian conflicts. And especially in a country where pedestrians outnumber bikes by a great deal. If you go to London, there's a lot of bikes there now, but pedestrians are king of the castle, and that's great. I mean, that's fantastic. And there's a lot of concern about fast-moving men in Lycra conflicting with pedestrians in unexpected spaces. And I think this design exaggerates that or highlights that and makes that worse. A little thought experiment on the screen. If you can imagine, we're going to do a little bit of traffic modeling here. If there's 400 cyclists coming from the right-hand side of the screen, is that your right as well? Anyway, I don't know how that works.
Yes.
The green line, you can see 400 cyclists per day crossing towards the west, let's say. There's 200 cyclists that cross towards the north, approaching the pedestrian crossing where the blue triangle is. That pedestrian trying to cross the road is going to stand there, and they're going to look at the traffic light, which is on the far side of the intersection. Now, at the same time, they're going to have to look at those 600 cyclists a day, right? That's the risk over the day approaching them. Now, imagine if there's 2 pedestrians crossing per day and 600 cyclists, you have 2 times 600, a potential risk of 1,200. It's a very simplified way of saying it. If we would compare that, so remember that number, 1,200. If we compare that to a Dutch intersection, if you have 2 pedestrians trying to cross, the pedestrian on the bottom there only has to cross paths with 200 cyclists a day. And the pedestrian that's trying to cross northbound, I hope you're still with me, is having to cross 450 cyclists per day. So that adds up to 650 cyclists for the 2 pedestrians combined. So that means the potential exposure to risk, again, this is not a real traffic hazard because it's a cyclist and a pedestrian and they tend to get along reasonably well. But if you are concerned about pedestrians being hit by cyclists, you've basically doubled your potential risk by putting all of the crossings, all of the pedestrian crossing in one spot and having to match both of those or having to meet both of those cyclist flows. So that's the biggest concern I have for the situation in the UK, where maybe now there's not that many cyclists or pedestrians. So
but the ultimate goal is to reach the capacity that we see on many streets here in the Netherlands.
Exactly. Yeah. And if you put this outside a university, you can imagine that there's hundreds of pedestrians crossing and hundreds of cyclists. And that's where I'm a little bit, well, nobody's going to die, but people aren't going to dislike crossing there. And that's going to reflect badly on this innovative design. So that's, especially if you put them all around the university in one go, people are going to think, this is not comfortable. If you don't feel comfortable crossing there with your child, or have your child cross there by themselves, it's going to be annoying.
Right. So then inherently you would revert to what happens in a lot of North American cities or in the UK, where then they will just drive instead.
Exactly.
Which is not what we want at all.
That's not what you want. No. And of course there's reasons to do this, one of those reasons that they come up with is, or they, the designer, I talked to them. One of the reasons, or one of the concerns, maybe not the designer of the cycles because he knows, but there's concerns about the detour for pedestrians. And if you look at this image, if you can imagine walking from the south, yes, there is a bit of a detour trying to reach the zebra crossing, because that is a few meters out. For a Dutch person, this is normal, so that's not a big deal. It's literally a matter of 1 or 2 seconds extra travel time, but it does technically inconvenience a pedestrian over a cyclist, which I appreciate because pedestrians are the most important. However, at a design like this, if you can imagine that if this were a Dutch design, those pedestrians and bike movements were flipped, and as you can see, the lines, the blue and the yellow line, they're basically the same length. You can't distinguish objectively that the detour for the red crossing on the yellow line is shorter than the blue line. So I don't think that argument is very valid for building this style. If you do it properly, you can make the detour for pedestrians as short as possible if you prioritize that. It's just a matter of making choices. Then there's one actually quite good point about the Cyclops, is if you do have a lot of diagonal crossings at an intersection. So this is the original, for the first mock-ups or renderings of a Cyclops in Manchester as well. And you can imagine if there is a lot of people crossing diagonally, the Cyclops does save them a lot of time because they can do that in one stage instead of having to cross in 2 stages. That does mean that you're taking a lot of time out of the signal phase for getting those people across. In this instance, it works because it's kind of a skewed intersection, so it is fairly short. But if you can imagine on this intersection, if you wanted to get people to cross diagonally, you would have a lot of red time for all of the cars, and it would probably not be acceptable for the politicians anymore.
And then I guess in the same way that once the capacity builds up with bikes, if you have that long phasing time, you're eventually going to have to create a long phasing for people on bikes as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you will, because especially if you want to have, in the UK, you can't have that permissive left or permissive right that we do in the Netherlands, where you let bikes go first for a few seconds and then you allow cars to follow them yet yield. If that's not allowed, it means you have to have a full phase for pedestrians and bikes, which in theory is fine and very safe, so that's good. But at the same time, it does put the pressure on those crossing points where the pedestrians need to cross the bikeway, because they're going to arrive at that same point at the same time. Right. So that's a concern of mine, but I'm very much looking forward to evaluation of the first Cyclops, and we'll see if I have to eat my words. In which case we will organize a whole new webinar just in praise of the Cyclops, but we'll see. And then one last image that I wanted to show is this intersection in Waltham Forest in London, where they decided that no, we're not going to do a Cyclops, we're going to build a Dutch style intersection, and I think it is pretty much perfect, except that they forgot to put in a raised island where the yellow circle is. They painted that, which is a real shame, because that means a car can still turn quite fast, and it's not going to be reduced in speed by that island. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next few slides. So it is possible. We can build this in the UK, so why don't we make this the standard?
Leonard's next challenge.
Next challenge.
Okay, well, our next question then is, do Dutch designs attempt to support people cycling to maintain momentum, or do they try to slow them down?
Yes.
Both.
Both. Sometimes both. It, again, context sensitive. The default is to just have a flush surface, pretty straight, like slight wiggle, but make it as comfortable as possible, and really allow for the cyclist to just roll through. But we are seeing the downsides of huge numbers of cyclists at the moment. So there is specific pinch points or specific locations, city center of Amsterdam, central station in Utrecht, where there is, well, we have car problems with bikes. So if there is 35,000 bikes a day, that is a serious challenge, and that also has negative effects. So you're going to have to do something. In Amsterdam, behind the central station, there's the ferry building or the ferry terminal, where people cross, and they built the shared space there. But it's a huge conflict point of hundreds of cyclists and hundreds of pedestrians crossing every hour. So that's where you need to do something. So yes, there are design solutions that help us manage the not so much the speed, but more the awareness of the cyclist. It is really hard to slow down a cyclist properly. And the design on the left is maybe a little bit older, but it's in Amsterdam, where they literally raised the intersection of two bikeways very, well, quite gently. So it's you don't have to slow down for it, but you automatically will a little bit, and at least you're a little bit more aware of your circumstances. It's not a straight through, off you go. You have full right of way. So that's one solution to just raise awareness, which is often enough to make it a little bit safer. However, if that's not the case, you have to do something a little bit more drastic, and that's on the right-hand side image on the screen. This is a speed table for bikes, where they had to slow down the cyclists and also the mopeds, so the scooters, they're not great. They had to be slowed down, and this is probably one of the first instances that I've seen where it's a pretty severe traffic calming measure on the bikeway, quite an abrupt level change, which is pretty uncomfortable to ride on. Nobody likes it, but it tends to work to a degree to slow down people, and they get a real jolt, so they really pay attention when they hit it. But some people just ride on the footpath instead. So there's always give and take. With the best intentions, you can build a nice traffic calming thing for bikes, but if the curb is a centimeter high, then you're just going to pop on the curb and have a nice smooth surface. So it's a tricky one.
Fair enough. All right, our next question. In a typical North American scenario, the textbook intersection, there's no real money for transformation, but a willingness to implement cheap, simple ideas to increase safety. What would you say to that?
One, you're looking for the silver bullet. It does not exist. But two, there's a lot you can do to actually make it quite a bit safer. But it does start with having the willingness to slow down cars, because that's the biggest thing. If you have no political will or willingness to stand up to a community and say, yes, we're going to slow down cars and it's going to be good, then yeah, you're doomed. But if you do have that political will, positive thinking, these would be the two features that I would say you should focus on in this scenario. If you have a normal intersection, there is, for example, on-street bike lanes already. It can be quite or relatively easy, especially if there's on-street parking. You have a little bit of space. Taking one or two car parks away will give you enough space to put in these corner islands, for example. And they don't have to be expensive. They just have to have something vertical on it. So it can be a planter pot. It can be a couple of planter pots. It can be a giant rock or a flexi post, whatever works. I prefer the rock over the flexi post because car drivers tend to be a little bit more scared of a rock than a flexi post. But depends on where you are, if you can find a big rock, I guess. And then the second one, which is often overlooked, but it is that separator, or at least that vertical element at the nose of the intersection, the bull nose at the front, because that really reduces the angle at which people can approach the outward lane, basically. So that green car, you can imagine if that was a left turn, If there was no median and no bullnose island or no vertical element there, they could just race in there. But because of that vertical element, they really have to approach it at 90 degrees almost. And that really slows people down. And at least they're more aware of that turn and what the lane is that they have to be in. And it's not just me that's saying that, because there was probably a very expensive safety study undertaken in the US. I forgot who published it, but it was quite recent, where the recommendation was that cities start putting in this type of treatment, which is just a very simple rumble strip. Even if you don't have space for a median, that's fine. Just anything vertical will help slow people down, because you can imagine that the dotted line on the left can be done at 50 miles an hour. Mm-hmm. The dotted line on the right is 20 or 30, and that means that little outline of a pedestrian may not be a body painted on the street, but it may actually be. Well, I'm looking at it, I'm like, that's not good.
No.
They might actually make it across either alive or only injured. This is not funny. No, I mean, the key thing for saving pedestrian lives is speed, and that's just so important. So anything you can do to reduce the speed at the point of conflict at an intersection is going to help. And usually that's pinching cars. And you can always say trucks need to turn and fire trucks need to be able to race through, and that's all well and good, but a little vertical element like that is enough to deter most or 99% of drivers from mm-hmm. doing that, which is cost you $500, saves lives.
Yeah.
So do that. Then if you are feeling more adventurous and you want to do those corner islands, this is a great example. I believe it's New York. Yeah, yep. New York. Where they've just taken their on-street bikeway, gave them a little bit of a bend out, but the bend out's really only there because there's 4 flexi posts. But you can immediately see what happened, what happens in this scenario versus what would happen if those posts were not there. Because this car is almost at 90 degrees with the bike lane, so they can actually look fairly comfortably over their shoulder instead of having to strain when they would cut the corner a little bit. And there's a lot more space and time for people to see each other and to anticipate each other's movements. That does not mean that this is going to be a 100% safe scenario, but it is a very cheap and easy case in point of what you're trying to achieve with a protective island without having to fully reconstruct your intersection, because that can be very expensive. Mm-hmm. So I think this is a great example, and this photo just illustrates it beautifully. If you want to be a little bit more creative, the Streets Blend Collective took this photo as just stick with flexi posts when you can actually make it into a cool feature project. Don't know how long this would last, but again, if you're just trying to illustrate to your local engineers that yes, this can be done, the intersection still operates, the trucks can still pass, it's fine. This is a great feature and a great way to, collaborate with local artists, mm-hmm. local children, get all your local traffic engineers involved and let them see it works. It's fine. Don't worry about it. It's not rocket science.
All right. So do the Dutch have numeric thresholds for deciding separate signal phasings for bikes versus right turns? And if so, what are they?
Yes, of course. Well, I say of course, but that's actually not. We had to dig a little bit for this. The Great Dutch Book on Intersections doesn't exist. There is a guide, but it's just not very good. There's actually a lot better stuff coming out of the US at the moment, which is ironic. But yes, there is a threshold. So yes, we do allow, we've seen this image before, we do allow permissive right turns. But we can get away with it because there is both a lateral shift for the bike lane, so 5 meters over, and a longitudinal shift in the bike lane. So the bikes actually start 6 meters or 10 meters ahead of the cars. So while you're both waiting for a red light, the car can already see the bike sitting there, or multiple bikes, and they can actually already see bikes zooming along because they're all waiting for a red light. So by just giving those bikes that are there a few seconds lead in time, most of them will be able to get across before the car even starts to move. Mm-hmm. Then the car will crawl forward, quite a sharp turn, so roll relatively slow. And then you can have a permissive right, which saves you a lot of capacity, which also means that the whole signal phase can be quicker, which means that there's less red light running and all the other bikes can go quicker as well. So it does have benefits for cars, obviously, but it also has benefits for bikes and benefits for space, because a quicker light phase means less stacking space, if you want to get very technical. So that's why a lot of Dutch intersections can get away with 1 or 2 lanes instead of having 5 lanes of stacking space and having to wait 2.5 minutes or 3 minutes. Most Dutch traffic lights are 90 seconds or less, especially in the cities. It's like 45 seconds and then start all over again. What was the question?
Signal phasing, but I think what I wanted to ask is, correct me if I'm wrong, because it's, in my experience so far, pedestrians even more so have a head start over the bike. So it's head start for pedestrians, then bikes, then cars.
Yeah, often they do, especially if there's like a staged, or well, a potentially 2-stage pedestrian crossing. It's rarely that you actually have to wait in the middle, but often there's 2 sets of traffic light, one to the median and one to the far end. If you want to cross against the traffic, for example, you can often get a head start earlier, because the movement that has already passed moves past quicker than the ones that have to come across on the other side of the intersection. So yes, then it will be pedestrians coming across first, and then sometimes pedestrians going ahead first as well, and then bikes, but a lot of bikes tend to look at the pedestrian light as well and being a little bit opportunistic. But the numeric threshold. Right. So the number is 150, 150 cars per hour. If it's more than that, you shouldn't really mix them. You should have a separate phase, because then the risk becomes too high. But of course, it's a guideline, and it's arbitrary. You have a lot of trucks, for example, with no blind spot detection. That might be problematic, because they can't turn far enough to be 90 degrees, and that tends to be the biggest risk factor. So in a port or a logistical center, don't worry, don't do it. Right. Don't even bother. Just be a full protective phase if you can. Okay.
Our next question, again around signals, is signal separation as safe as protected geometry?
So much signal talk is so good.
Well, it is an intersection after all.
This is true. This is true. Short answer is no. It can be, like in theory. What they mean is, if you have a bike lane on the road, for example, and they just sit there, if I hold the cars back and just give the bikes green, give the pedestrians green, then stop all the cars again, give the bikes and the pedestrians across green, they are in theory fully separated and fully safe, right? They're not separated in space, but they're separated in time. So that sounds legit. That's a way to do it. Except there's a little annoying thing about people, because people tend to not comply and tend to not see the light. And that maybe 1%, maybe 0.5%, but even that is too many, because nothing is going to stop them from rolling through the intersection, and there's no redundancy in it. There's no forgiveness, so if you turn, you're immediately onto the bike lane. So even if the bike made a mistake and looked at the wrong light, for example, and they thought it was green because they are in a hurry, and they looked at the car light instead of the bike light, car turns, there's zero room for error. Right. And that's just a real problem, and that's something that can be at least partially remedied by having that 5-meter setback, which means you have a second or second and a half to respond and come to a full stop before you hit a person. Right. So that's it's a good start, and I think a lot of cities, it is something you can implement pretty much overnight, because it doesn't require any physical changes. Maybe put up a new traffic light, but that's not a huge investment compared to fully separating the bikeway. But by no means is it enough to keep people actually safe. Yeah, that was my answer. Okay. Oh, this is. I think we're doing the second half. We're doing the second half of this question? Okay, so sorry, it's a long one. But the summary is, what is the advice on retrofitting current intersections on roads with no bicycle lanes and also have on-street parking? Yeah, so we talked about this a little bit at the previous question, right, about putting in the bollards and stuff. And that's not just us that are saying that. I mean, of course, we're advocates for doing this, but there's some really, really good guidance from NACTO that came out recently. It is called Don't Give Up at the Intersection. It is a great resource. I would fully endorse using that because they talk about exactly that in the American context. They used most of the standards from the Netherlands as well, with 150 right turns, for example. But they also give you some real practical guidance on how to implement this on a temporary or a lighter, quicker, cheaper, which is what they're all about, basis. So that's a really good resource. It's available for free. So if you're in the US, it's fantastic to use, and it will get you a, well, not as pretty or not as good looking intersection, but at least it's functional. It will be much safer than the default intersection. So definitely use that. And if you have on-street parking, you have the space, right? Then it's a matter of priorities.
Perfect. Okay. Again, for jurisdictions in the US, we're looking for models in the US as opposed to internationally of what are the most outstanding American examples of designing safe intersections for cycling. Using protected intersections or roundabouts. It's a long sentence.
That's a long sentence. So good American examples. Well, there's good news and there's bad news. Clearly, there is a lot of protected intersections that are being built or have been built in the last few years. If you look at the whole set of intersections in the US, it's a fraction of a percent, but the momentum is growing, and there's some really good guidance, a lot of attention on it for it. So that it is getting better, and every iteration is getting a little bit better, and there are some really good designs, but none of them are perfect, obviously. I'm not saying all of the Dutch ones are perfect, because they're far from. But if we do get to criticize, and hey, you're here to listen to us critique other people's work, obviously. Some good and some bad things. I think this is a really, actually quite good example from Berkeley in California. I think it was 2017 that it was built. And you can see a lot of the elements that we would recommend. It's obviously a retrofit, so it was fitted onto the existing corridor. They have some bike facilities, but on-road on all the approaching streets. But they did a really good job at getting in the islands, making sure that you can get ahead. It's a little bit confusing from the ground level, because you do, as a cyclist, you are a little bit in limbo about where you should be, which is not bad necessarily, because this means you'll go slow and there's not a real conflict with pedestrians. There's a few things that I would probably tweak, maybe a little bit more of a vertical element on those corner islands to make drivers really be worried about that island damaging their car. Because if there's one thing that slows people down, is the worry about getting a scratch. So I'd make that a little bit bulkier, or just put on a planter pot. You know, it's going to be something small like that. Also, obviously, the markings are a little bit confusing about, can you go ahead to the stop line? I'm not 100% sure. I don't actually think it's legal, but I might be wrong on that. So that's a few things that might clarify it. But like the end result is they do have the buffer. It does slow people down, maybe not to. It could be a little bit narrower to really pinch those big SUVs. But it is a good retrofit design that I think looks quite nice. There's one pet peeve though, which is the traffic light placement, because as you can see here, this car is obviously stopped at the traffic light, but already encroaching on the pedestrian crossing, and they're going to be focused on that light in the far background, right? That light is high up in the middle on the other side of the road. So here's a mock-up we did for a client earlier, just to illustrate a point. But if you're driving and you're focused on that light where the light blob is in the middle, that's what your primary looking point is, right? I want to see if that light's going to turn orange or not. Can I go or can I not go? And that means you're not actually looking at that little pedestrian man. This is a photo montage, not my best work. But if there's a pedestrian crossing, I'm not going to be looking at him at all. He's completely outside my line of sight, especially if the speed is 50 miles an hour or 30 miles an hour, whatever. Doesn't really matter. Now, the little trick, my beautiful city of Leiden, where I used to live, they have all of their lights on the near side signals, and that sounds like a minor difference, but it actually changes the whole dynamic of where you need to look as a driver. Because if you can imagine that, we can go back to the image, if the light is on the near side, if we can go back to the image, There you go, thank you. If the light's on the near side and actually close to where the pedestrian is crossing, that's where my attention is focused. So that means that any pedestrian waiting to cross is actually right within my field of vision, and I can see if there is going to be a potential for a crash or somebody that I need to look out for, while at the same time looking if my light turns green or not. So it's two birds in one stone, and you can actually see everything that's important at that point you can see in one glance without having to flick your eyes around, which is important.
Right.
Then one more example from the US, from Portland. It is extremely bright green, which we can do a whole nother webinar about.
It's surprising considering Seattle is usually the one known for their bright green, but that's a...
I think they took a leaf out of the book and said, okay, the brightest green we can find, we got it. But I think this is an interesting example, and it's quite a nice example because, as you can see, there's also an unsignalized protected intersection. I don't know if there's many of these, but it's just a four-way stop. With the full features of a protected intersection, and you can imagine that this could work beautifully if you put some lights in, if you wanted to. But it's got all the things. It's got the islands. It's got pretty narrow approaches, so not really a need for that central median. Although I would still like that nose thing at the front, so that would be another feature that I like. But the one thing that I really don't like about this is this little detail. It's a fairly narrow bike lane, and these curbs just look terrifying to me because I'm worried that I will hit one of those curbs with my pedal, and it's a pretty quick wiggle. It's quite a tight turn. And I think, well, especially when it gets busier, maybe if you're the only cyclist on this bikeway, it's fine. But if there's other people there and you have to avoid something, or there's a branch on the path, anything, you hit the pedal and you fall off with a lamppost there, and And that's just a small detail that's quite easily avoidable by just putting in a 45-degree angled curb on this side, so cars don't roll over it, but a bike is fine. And also on the side of the footpath is what I would do. So nice try. Almost there, almost perfect.
This would be one of those scenarios that I could remember cycling through with our kids when they were very young and being quite nervous about who goes where. Yeah,
because do you cycle next to your child then? Can you fit two of you without hitting the curbs? Yeah, exactly. And that makes you a little bit uncomfortable, and that's easily remedied because you don't have the same here if there's a 45-degree curb, right? It's less tricky. Just roll up onto the footpath if necessary. Yeah, so that was the good, the bad, and the ugly. And that was the questions, I think.
Yeah, that's it.
Right on time.
Good job.
Within an hour.
We were a little worried.
That's 58 slides.
So thanks for answering all those questions, Leonard. As we said, if you have any more, feel free to tag us on Twitter with your questions or send us an email, whatever is easiest for you.
Or hire us.
That's also helpful. And also be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to keep abreast of new webinars coming up. A couple of things just to mention before we close out. If you have been following along, you are aware that we are collaborating with Project for Public Spaces, which is really exciting, for some virtual training starting in October. And so you can register for that still. It starts in about 2.5 weeks, I think, is where we're at. We're really excited to be working with them and basically sharing both American and Dutch knowledge with the participants. So check that out if you're interested. We also still are working with various municipalities with our MOBYCOACH program, which is a good entryway into getting some advice from one of our experts like Leonard, and seeing how we can help you address maybe some challenges you're having or help you work through some design ideas that just need some expert knowledge. And then finally, our next webinar is actually a French webinar. So, si tu parles français, tu peux en rejoindre on the 21st of September. It will be similar to the traffic calming webinar that we did a few months ago with Mary and Leonard, but this time featuring our consultants Stephen and Sophie speaking in French to our French-speaking audience. That is all for us. Once again, thanks, Leonard. Thank you to our crew who always do such an amazing job.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
And we will see you next time.
Thank you very much.